Welcome everybody. I think we're going to get started to continue with the section called Rulemaking. And before we get to this panel, which is class 4, we have 2 housekeeping matters to note. The first is a hand reminder: if anyone wants to sign up for the audience participation, it is up front. We're going to start that at 1:30 tomorrow. If anyone wishes to speak briefly on any of the classes that we're considering and did not participate in the hearing. And the second issue is for class 1, there were 2 documents which all the panelists were provided in advance right before the hearing, as well as the office and NTAA. We're just going to label them on the record as a way to make clear what they were, and they will also be on our website. So they are exhibits 1I and 1J, and we just wanted to notate that for our court reporter. And I will also say, as we start this hearing, we've been doing a pretty poor job of announcing who is speaking. So if you can remember to either say your name or be called upon before responding, that would, I think, help out the transcription that I'm doing. So we are here to now discuss class 4, which is a petition for an exemption for audiovisual works that are protected by high bandwidth digital content protection, HDCP. It would cover a variety of audiovisual works stored on media that passes over HDMI connections. And this is a request for a new exemption that has not previously been considered by the Copyright Office. So my name is Reagan Smith. I'm the Deputy General Counsel, and I think first we'll announce ourselves on this side, and if the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Stacy Cheney, Senior Attorney Advisor at NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Good afternoon.
Tom Riley, Attorney Advisor, Copyright Office.
Anna Chavez, Assistant General Counsel of the Copyright Office.
Julie Zaltman, Assistant General Counsel of the Copyright Office.
I'm Kit Walsh. I'm a Senior Staff Attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm here representing Dr. Bunny Huang, a petitioner seeking the exemption.
Matt Williams from MSK, representing AAP, ESA, RIAA, and NPAA.
Jim Berger from Thompson Copeland, representing digital content protection. If I could have 2 seconds after to clarify something you just said.
Do you want to go ahead now?
Yeah, HDCP is not a storage protection technology. It's a transmission protection technology.
All right, so Taylor, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, David Taylor, counsel to DVD, CCA, and AACSLA.
All right, so Mr. Berger, can you talk about, I guess I got it wrong, or perhaps the petitioner got it wrong?
It's just a short distance transmission protection. In other words, if a TPM, for example, on AACS on a Blu-ray triggers HDCP, it is decompressed to a very large file, and little packets are sent over and encrypted by HDCP. It checks that there's an HDCP device, licensed device at the other end, and it decrypts and goes to the display. It's not a store, you can't store an HDCP. It's only a transmission protection technology.
Got it. I think either what I said or what I meant to say is that the audiovisual works themselves may be stored on a variety of media.
Maybe streamed also.
But that sounds correct to you.
Yeah, that didn't come across to me that way.
All right,
No.
My apologies. It's also misunderstanding too.
No, it's just important to the case to understand what HDCP does and doesn't do.
Sure.
Thank you.
HDCP is the encryption technology that's used over the HDMI audiovisual connection. So it does relate to that as opposed to works that are at rest. The works that are at rest may be subject to any number of other technological protection measures. HDCP is a sort of common point through which a lot of different types of audiovisual works flow. It's a natural point to do transformative things with that video because it's a single technology as opposed to dozens of other TPMs that you might have to engage with if you wanted to approach the processing of that technology at a different point.
So there's a good question about how you said that. You said it's a natural point to do transformative things. But I think maybe what you might mean, and tell me if it's wrong, is that it's a natural point because it protects a variety of media, a variety of TPMs to engage in circumvention to then get media, which perhaps you store whatever way you want to store it, and then you do the transformative things. Is that right?
So in part, the reason I say in part is because only some of the uses that we've talked about involve that storage step with respect to the entire work. For many of the uses, there's a buffer. So you have these packets coming along, HDMI, You would need to decrypt them, create a buffer, then do your analysis on it. So if you wanted to translate Mandarin characters into English, if you wanted to identify your favorite baseball player and have an image track them, you collect enough of the work on an intermediate machine to do that, and then once you've done the processing, you package it back up and send it along to the display device.
Okay, so it's your understanding that some of the uses that Dr. Fine would seek to engage in might require copying forward, and some might not, because you're not saying you put it on the buffer and pass it off and go to the next piece. Correct? Is that more or less?
Yes, some of them would involve the entire work and some would not.
Thank you.
I disagree in the sense that if this were the case, most of the, in fact, all of the examples that are given are today possible in the clear content, which is most content. And people don't do it in the HDMI world. They don't use that as a common point. Baseball is mostly all free to air, which you could do all these. In fact, TV broadcasters have done it. It's just not popular in the market. Nobody's demanding it. It could be done in HDMI, but they don't, because it's not the place to do it. It is in the set-top box where it comes in, or at the smart TV at the other end. We're again talking about exemptions that are possible or not possible for other TPMs. It doesn't make sense to do this at HDMI because it's not the natural point to do it, because it would be done in all these other examples, but it's not. It's done in the devices that are either receiving it and processing it, or the smart TV that is receiving it and processing it and doing it. But people don't do HDMI storage. They don't use that as a storage mechanism or manipulation mechanism.
I don't know that that's the question though here, right? The HDMI is just a transport mechanism. We're
Right.
not doing anything in there,
Right.
rather than it's transporting over. And it doesn't complete the transfer until that the circumvention or the TPM unlocks it to allow them to complete the transaction.
That's
Is that right?
that's if it's a TPM. The majority of the examples that are given in Dr. Wong's petition and in the reply are free-to-air examples.
And they don't have a TPM.
They don't have TPM. It's not triggered. It's only when you play a Blu-ray, a high-definition Blu-ray, when in the process of handing it over to the output, the HDMI output, it requires HDCP to be triggered. But if you're just watching any of your over-the-air channels, for example, any of those channels, it's never triggered. It's not protected. It's only in high-value content that has business models around the high value that I'm sure you've heard in all the other audiovisual exemption processes. That's where it gets triggered. But for most of the content that flows over HDMI, it's unencrypted.
Would that include things like Netflix?
No, Netflix, which is a subscription service, you're not buying the movie, you are effectively renting it. And so that would probably, I don't know for a fact for Netflix, whether they require in their licenses, and Matt may know the answer to this, whether they require HDCP to be triggered.
There's several points. One, many of the examples involve the kind of entertainment works like movies, et cetera, that by admission are typically encumbered by HDCP. Two, many playback devices default to, or in fact, it's not just a default, it cannot be disabled. The output is HDCP encrypted. So for example, the PlayStation 3 device.
Do you know about the baseball example Mr. Berger said? He said it would come unencrypted, whether an exemption would be necessary.
I think that there are paid sporting events for which HDCP would be applied. But as for over-the-air baseball, then it would be applied if your device is one of those that always applies HDCP.
Mr. Berger?
But the PlayStation 3 is obsolete. It's now PlayStation 4, and all of the game software, all the gameplay can be streamed in the clear. Yes, for high value, I'm sorry?
PS3 gameplay?
No, PS3 is obsolete. They've come out with, I mean, it proves the point that we're making. The market, and where there is a demand, and there is in the clear, and again, putting aside the DVDs and pay-per-view, which is protected because that's the business model, and you deal with that in those TPM, in the exemption requests for those TPM. But again, the bulk of the data over, including PlayStation 4, the bulk of the data is unencrypted. And if a manufacturer turns something on, I'm not aware of that. That's certainly possible that they could do it improperly. But most of the examples I know, they don't turn it on for over the air. They don't turn it on for the game machines. None of the game machines turn it on now for play except the old PS3, which is people don't buy it.
I had the third point.
Yes, Ms. Walsh?
So with regard to the licensed uses, these are, as I think Mr. Junior was getting at, these are things that happen on a licensed device as a result of decrypting HDCP. So if you don't have a license or if you don't purchase that device, then it's among the uses that require circumvention. Now, DCP Association is saying these functions exist. They're available in the marketplace. For instance, the new video game consoles have the ability to turn off HDCP, which if that's the way that devices work by default, then we probably wouldn't be here.
So
So
do
it's
you
not
agree for
perfect.
new video games, you don't need this exemption?
For devices where the user is in control and can turn off HDCP in order to make those non-infringing uses, which includes the PlayStation 4, yes.
I mean, they've submitted a variety of video games, and you said PlayStation 3, I guess, is the only one that does. I know, I mean, at least you can go to Twitch and see PlayStation 3. I'm not sure how that happens, and I don't know if you know how that happens. Mr. Williams is rated in 10. He knows how that happens, but I'm trying to just like narrow down the video games specifically. Why is there a need for this exemption first, and then get into these broader issues that you touched on?
Sure, so I don't think that the PlayStation 3 is the only legacy console for which this is true.
Can you point to another one?
I'd have to get back to you.
We give the examples. And, so go ahead, Matt.
Sure, thanks. So we've already touched on 10 or 12 different types of uses, and that's in the first instance why I think this is an improper class. It's just pretty much all motion pictures for all non-infringing uses, so that by itself is.
Audiovisual works, so it's a little broader than that.
Excuse all audio. Good point. Yes, because it includes video games. So very, very good point. So that's one reason to deny the class in itself. I think even the specific non-exhaustive list, there's no real meat on the bones for most of these uses to enable you to analyze whether they're fair or not in all instances. The other primary problem is there are alternatives. You've put your hand on it with the new gaming consoles, but even if you're talking about the PS3, there are multiple avenues, as I understand it, to engage in these same uses. So number one is you can get a lot of PS3 games through a service called PlayStation Now, which is available on the PS4. And that's a subscription service, but as I understand it, a lot of the legacy games from PS3 are on PS4 through that service. There's not backward compatibility, as I understand it, in the sense that you could use a disc from the PS3 world and move it into the PS4 world, but you can still get a lot of those games through that service on the new console. Another thing is that even before the PS4, I think a lot of people were using component cables to extract game clips. And I mean, you know, it's important to know that the PS4 has been around since before the last rulemaking cycle, so this has been going on a long time. But if you go, for example, onto Twitch and you look at how to broadcast console games, there's an explanation of how to use the component cable. I don't know if you're all familiar with the different. Yeah, right. The old ones that you would use before, you just had one HDMI cable that has the multiple colors. And as I understand it, and as described on Twitch at least, you can still use those cables to export game content from the PS3. So I don't know that every device on the market that enables that type of conduct. I haven't analyzed them all, so I can't say they're all not circumvention devices, but my understanding is that there are avenues for that. I think, you know, some of this is about, it's not about just enabling circumvention of HDCP, it's really about enabling Mr. Long to sell this device that he wants to sell to enable everyone to make complete copies of in the clear content. And so when you put up against the potential harm of people, for example, buying temporary access to a work like a movie and being able to fully copy it and get full value purchase price for permanent access, and you put that up against the fact that there are all these alternatives in the marketplace to do everything at issue, I think it's just not a proper class reconciliation.
Ms. Walsh?
So Dr. Fine has always been extraordinarily conscientious about adhering to the law. And it's not proper, in my opinion, to speculate that he would do something that he didn't have the legal right to do.
I don't think Mr. Williams was necessarily suggesting that we wouldn't be entertaining an exemption just for Dr. Long. So I think to factor that into your answer too.
So in regard to the suggestion that you don't need to be able to circumvent the signal coming out of your PlayStation 3 because you could just spend a couple $100 on a new device. You could just buy the same game that you paid for again, or you could have a lower quality component video. None of those are substitutions. You can't require someone to pay a fee in order to do something that they have a legal right to do. And that's an adverse impact on a non-infringing use. And the question in this rulemaking is, are there adverse effects on users' ability to make non-infringing uses? And we've gone through a very long list of examples of non-infringing uses that are adversely affected by the ban on circumventing HDCP, including some very personal ones. And Dr. Fine shouldn't necessarily have to disclose that he's at elevated risk for early onset Alzheimer's in order to explain why it's so important that he be able to engage in time shifting, space shifting of the works that he's going to continue to enjoy.
What do you say to the opposition where he's trying to say there's literally dozens of alternatives and different ways Dr. Fung can make all of these uses that he seeks to do?
So the alternatives are you buy a closet full of televisions that have
I don't think so. There are
capability.
dozens of examples and they don't see in your written comments that you've engaged with them at all. So I think they have more specifics than that statement would suggest. Can you engage more specifically with some of the appendices of different services or ways you might be able to enable a smart television to make some of these uses he seeks to?
So I think that is the response to the idea that there are, a dozen different smart TVs that have different subsets of functionality. Many of the examples don't have.
Just in fairness, not all of them are limited to just getting another smart TV. Like when we're talking about typical VCR quote unquote functionality, they're talking about there are numerous digital video recording devices which aren't necessarily just buying smart TV. Like you could be from Comcast or whoever your provider can provide something. So I think to kind of maybe be more specific, but also not just saying it's buying another smart TV. I think we're kind of asking the same question. It's just really responding to the dozens of alternatives which seem to be present in the marketplace that are not just buying another television. So.
Yeah, well, you could buy another service or another device, but that's an alternative to a world where someone has the freedom to use their device that they like, to program their computer so they don't need to clutter their house with a whole bunch of devices. They don't need to spend money that people don't have the right to extract from them, but they're able to take the Blu-ray that they purchased and the TV that they own and make non-infringing uses without being required to pay some additional tax or fee to a company that's getting a license to HDCP.
Well, I guess my question relatedly is because you keep talking about non-infringing uses, but like for example, space shifting, time shifting, courts have found that is not, or I should say space shifting specifically is found not to constitute fair use. So what is the basis then for saying that that's a non-infringing use in this context?
So when it's personal and non-commercial space shifting, like the uses contemplated by Dr. Huang, have not been subject to a decision that they're infringing.
So
And-
how are the facts here distinguishable then from the facts in like VidAngel or different things, like where, are you just saying it's purely because it's non-commercial, that's why?
VidAngel was an extensive commercial service and only the law in the Ninth Circuit. And several of the uses that we talked about were explicitly or similar to uses that were approved in the Betamax decision. So for instance, the idea that you would time and space shift and entertainment work to show to a medical patient for therapeutic reasons is one of the examples. And so,
Sorry, go on.
I lost my train of thought.
What, in your view, would distinguish this proposal from prior proposals that the office has rejected as being too overbroad, or do you see it just rather a request for the office to sort of change its view of just regulatory authority?
Yeah. So I think that the statute represents a method of regulation that is to impose a really broad restriction, one that encompasses a lot of protected speech. And then this rulemaking is a mechanism to vindicate some portion of the speech that is impeded. So the non-infringing uses of these works are all First Amendment protected activities that Dr. Huang would like to engage in. This rulemaking is the process whereby you can vindicate a set of those activities. And that set, we put a bunch of sort of dots on the record, and all those dots add up to a line, which is the spectrum of non-infringing uses. So given that it's been demonstrated that the ban on circumvention of HDCP on audiovisual works has an adverse impact on the ability to make non-infringing uses, it's now mandatory for the librarian to publish the class, the language of 1201A-D, 1201A-1D is mandatory, shall publish a class where that's standards.
So a question to follow up, and just a little bit to probe, and if you could walk us through how this would work. So one of your examples you use here is political expression, talk about First Amendment protected potential, and explain a live political debate rescaled so the text of a commentator's live blog is presented alongside it without obscuring the image. Can you describe the process that you would have to go through to make this work, including where the circumvention would happen of this particular HDCP technology, so that you could then do this thing that you're talking about?
Yes, so you have the signal coming across HDCP.
I'm stopping.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop you there because
Okay.
you lost me already. Coming across. So the signal is coming into which device?
Oh, okay.
So you have to make it pretty basic for me here so that I understand how this is working through.
Right. So you have your entertainment device. Let's say it's a multimedia playback device. It is encrypting content that leaves it over the HDMI cable using HDCP. You need to read that signal before it reaches your display device, your TV. So you have a device in between that's reading in the HDCP encumbered signal where this debate is being conveyed. So you decrypt the frames of that image so that you can rescale it. Because without knowing what the image is, you can't output a smaller version of it. You need to be able to read that data in order to do that scaling, to make it smaller so that the whole thing is still visible when you add commentary to the sides. So the commentary is coming from a second source. So your device here, that's the first sort of stop on the road for the HDCP encumbered HDMI signal, has intelligence in it in the sense that it's a general purpose computer.
That's where the circumvention is
Right.
occurring. Is
Right.
that you've plugged your HDMI cord into this device,
Mhm.
that then is where the circumvention is happening, so that you can then play with the frames, so you can then attach your second device or another device here, so that you can then put the two things together, the blog or the commentary that's gonna go beside them on the screen when you're done. Is that
Right, or a picture-in-picture signal coming from another HDMI signal, anything that requires you to be able to access the work, to rescale it, to relay it, to do processing on it, that's where that happens. And it could be a third device, or it could be a part of a display device. You know, if you have a smart TV that has a computer in it, then it could be the device where this happens. But in any event, it's at some point before the sort of dumb display that's just the sort of the pixels where you're going to be perceiving.
And do you need then to connect that HDMI cord again to the smart device for that transfer, that second transfer to happen, right? So that then is expecting, so you've re-encrypted it at that point, so that it goes back to the second device, so that then it's displayed with your additional content.
Right.
Is that right?
That's right.
Just a quick kind of follow-up, because in your opening statement, you were talking about how there could be kind of additional TPMs at the source, like if we're talking about a DVD or a Blu-ray, so why, I guess kind of two questions, like why wouldn't it be more appropriate to ask for exemption to circumvent the source of it, so like the DVD or the Blu-ray, and then secondly, if you kind of have the second TPM, if you were to have an exemption for the HDCP, would that get past the second TPM on the other end? Like, would it enable you to do what you want to do?
So at the point that it's traveling over HDMI, HDCP is the only TPM that is preventing you from accessing that signal, and the reason why it's more appropriate to seek an exemption there as opposed to exemptions for a laundry list of any other possible TPM that can be applied to an audiovisual work is because that's the logical point to do it at. It's because it's relatively standard. It's proprietary, but it's standardized. So it's possible, rather than addressing 30 different TPMs, to bypass HDCP and perform all of these transformative uses on whatever sort of upstream content has wound up passing through the HDMI cable.
Mr. Williams, Mr. Berger, had your records out for a while, so Mr. Williams and Mr. Berger.
Yeah, I'll let Jim speak to most of the technical questions. The political debate question with the live streaming content beside it, I mean, we do have lots of examples of TVs in the record that enable that, but even if you want to say, well, someone shouldn't have to buy a new TV to enable it, I think there's a couple of problems with that theory. One is Mr. Wong has already put a device into the marketplace that he says is not a circumvention device, that at least based on the marketing materials, makes it sound like a lot of that is already enabled. And so if you can do it without circumvention, I'm not sure why you would get an exception to do it here. The other thing is as you heard the description of that process, it's quite technically complicated and difficult. So the only way to satisfy a market for that exemption is to allow for distribution of tools. And although I'm not questioning Mr. Wong's personal motivations or integrity, I think he has publicly stated that that's the market he wants to fill. He wants to sell a device that is a altered version of the existing device that would be a circumvention device. And so I would be very cautious to grant an exemption. There are so many alternatives and other ways of doing this.
Mr. Williams, if you could sort of walk us through how one of those smart TVs would do what was being talked about there. Again, a little more in the technical sense, and maybe Mr. Berger can help us with that as well.
Sure.
It sounds like that part of what's going on here is a bit of a remix, right? So you're taking a section of the live video or live video while it's going on, and you're adding some of your own commentary, and perhaps that's being streamed elsewhere to your audience or whatever you might be doing, right?
First of all, let's take the example Mr. Wong gives in his petition. that there's a political speech and somebody's blogging commentary. First of all, almost every instance I'm aware of political speech comes over the air and comes unencrypted, so it wouldn't have HDCP. But even if it did, the Vizio has, it's called picture outside of picture. It's a function on many smart TVs, but basically it divides the TV into two pieces. One piece, it would be getting, assuming, if it's within the TV itself, that is where I'm confused about Mr. Wong's example, but if it's in the TV itself, it's not encrypted with HDCP. The TV just receives it, even if it's protected for some reason, and I don't know what political speech would be protected, but assuming it was protected, the TV doesn't even deal with HDCP. It just puts up the screen, it decrypts from the HDCPS, let's say one of the over the internet encryption systems, decrypts and displays it in half the screen, and then it would take the internet input off of Ethernet cable and put that in the other half, and they'd be there. It's not preventing speech in any way, and I'm having a difficult time with that. Also, this idea that, oh, you're gonna have to buy another TV. I think you've answered that to some degree, but I don't believe Mr. Wong is an irrational manufacturer of devices. He's gonna charge you for that box, so you're gonna have to buy something else anyway. And the long list of examples, just again, most of them are free to air. With respect to dementia and Alzheimer, I can refer Dr. Wong to several sites which recommend do not let dementia or Alzheimer's patients watch live video or even pre-recorded, unless it's pre-recorded for them, and there's a whole website of DVDs that you can buy for people with Alzheimer's and dementia to not disturb them. So I'm really confused by the speech is impeded, because no speaker is impeded here. No speaker is kept off of a television set by HDCP that I'm aware of. So I just have problems with that because it is being done, the functionality is there today, whether users want it. Most users are two-screen people. Most users will have their, I know my kids are like that, and I am sometimes too, will have their smartphone or their tablet in front of them while they're watching TV, and will be checking references and checking blogs. But it is doable today. There's nothing, HDCP does not stand in the way of that.
Ms. Moss, do you want to respond?
Sure. So 2 points. First, it's not at all difficult to circumvent HDCP. It's sort of described every step of how the signal moves, but HDCP, the master keys are out there. The academic literature on how you derive the master key if you don't have it is out there, and it's not a technically difficult thing to do. So HDCP is not operating to prevent people from accessing unencrypted content if they don't care about adhering to the law. Let me say that another way. If your intent is to break the law, for example, you want to infringe, you want to distribute an entirety of a copyrighted work in an infringing way, you can do that. HDCP isn't difficult to circumvent. But as is usually the case, the fact that there's this legal barrier means that people who want to stay within the contours of the law are the ones bearing the brunt of the prohibition. That's my first point.
I guess Mr. Burr's filing suggests it's a more inefficient way to engage in the uses that Dr. Wang wishes to engage in. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So there are two categories of uses for which the answer to that, there are different answers to that. So the first is all of these uses where we're talking about doing image processing. This is the place where you do it. You're not going to wait for it to be at rest. You're not going to grab your DVD. You want to be able to do your image processing on the stream as it's coming along in order to, to rescale it, to highlight, the feature that's of interest, to do real-time translation from one language to another and have it displayed on the screen. That's the point where you want access to the uncompressed signal in real time as it's passing along. In regard to the other category of uses, which are uses where you wind up storing something at rest afterwards, you're going to have to recompress it in any event anyway, and that's likely the way that the licensed devices operate, is they take the HDCP signal and they recompress it and then it's stored at rest. So there's no illogic in doing it at that step, and for both technical reasons And because of the problem that I talked about earlier with the multiplication of other possible TPMs, this is the point where it makes practical and technological sense to do it. My second point is that many of these features don't exist. So the idea that you can connect your Home Assistant to your television and have a blended overlay of information from your Home Assistant and whatever you're trying to watch, that doesn't exist in the market. And the app ecosystem on smart TVs is lagging way behind phones in large part because it's a closed ecosystem. There's one standard for HDMI signals. It's proprietary, and you don't have the way you can point your phone at Chinese characters and have it display an English translation or opinion, another version of what you're looking at thanks to processing that image. Even if that's a copyrighted work, that's something that doesn't exist for televisions in the absence of supervision.
So you think translation across the board in all
But typically the kinds of translations that we're talking about where you are an individual and you want to circumvent HDCP in order to do translation, then those are non-infringement.
And how is that not a derivative work?
It's at least a fair use. Look, you're not selling copies of your translations. You are using it in many cases for your own educational and personal reasons.
If I could add also, how is that, can you not do that now with the smart TV exemption that already exists? In other words, if you wanted to do a translation of a work, isn't there some allowability in the current smart TV exemption for that kind of use?
I'd like to hear from the folks who might bring a lawsuit in that case if they think that that's covered.
Mr. Williams?
I haven't seen that question posed, so I'm responding on the fly, but I think that what that exemption applies to is rendering a smart TV interoperable with some other application that's been developed. And so I guess I would have to understand better exactly the process by which this would be achieved. I'm not sure that there's some piece of software that the proponent here is trying to run on a smart TV. I think the objective is to use a device to hack the encryption within the cable that connects the smart TV to another device.
I guess my question is that, say someone developed an app that was third market, or was it part of the current app market for the smart TV, and then made that available, and somebody then went through the process of decrypting their smart TV and allowed that app to be functional to do this language translation and one of these other functions, would that not be covered under that current exemption?
I think the answer is no, if I understand the hypothetical, because the smart TV exemption is about circumventing a specific access control on the firmware to install an interoperable application, whereas this would involve another level of circumvention beyond that. But if they don't hack the HDCP and they can theoretically come up with an app that runs on the TV that can do real-time translation, and if that's determined to be a non-infringing use, which I have some thoughts about, then arguably it would fit. We do have cases cited. I don't recall if it's in this class of works. I know we do in some of the other classes of works. The case law on unauthorized translations is very clear that requires licensing. Whether it requires licensing for one individual person to do it in private in their home, I don't think is a set of facts that's ever been presented, but there is clear case law that says unauthorized translations that are distributed or not lawful use.
Mr. Taylor?
Yeah, David Taylor. What I get here is that it's the easiest point for them to attack all TPMs, and that if they can't have this exemption, then they have to go and talk to every TPM provider out there. And that just simply, every exemption that we've created, that the office has carefully weighed, and every limitation would be undone with this one single exemption. So I just don't see how it is a appropriate class. But more importantly, I don't think HDCP 2.2 has been hacked. And even if it were hacked, I mean, CSS was hacked a long time ago. It still doesn't take away that the law protects it as a matter. And I would also say that I'm a lawyer. I have some technological capabilities maybe, but I could not hack the following instructions that I've seen out there without it being severely amplified or facilitated by some third-party software. Would I be able to do it as easily as it's suggested? And it just goes back to the point that the only person who wants to do this is somebody who's engaged in, or likely to be engaging in putting into the marketplace a circumvention device.
Mr. Berger?
There's a whole bunch of points I just want to second what Mr. Taylor said. HDCP 2.x, which we're now up to 2.2, is not been hacked so far as we know. That's an old hack of HDCP 1.0. And there's a lot of it, even with HDCP protected content, the HDCP license allows an intermediary device or a television to image process the HDCP protected, as long as it's done within a protected environment. But also, you talk about all these features and apps we're talking about, put aside the protected world. Most video, I'm surprised how many people still watch over-the-air video either through their cable system or over the air, is unprotected. We don't see all these features with translation or whatever. They're not available today where they could be used for the majority of the content that's there. This is a market question. It's not.
We've been weird feedback, and DC moving our phones might help. Maybe they're different from the microphones, so I don't know if that will help, but
Maybe set
in
too,
the event it won't play.
maybe set too sensitive. I'll step back and hopefully you can still hear me.
All right.
But the point being is this is a market issue, and almost every consumer electronics company in the world has an HDCP license. And if they thought there was a market for a particular feature, why aren't they doing it for over-the-air television, which is a majority of political speech, sports? Yes, there are some protected sports programming that you pay for that you wouldn't have otherwise unless you paid for it. There's a whole bunch of material that could benefit, and I put that in quotes, from all these apps, but nobody is doing them because there isn't a market. Where there is a market, for example, Sony with PlayStation 3 realized they were falling behind Xbox and other game consoles who permitted unencrypted output of play. They said, we're going to go with the market. So this problem with this is it's a manufacturer who doesn't want to take a license. The idea that users, as Mr. Taylor said, I spent 10 years at Apple. I couldn't possibly follow the instructions even to circumvent HDCP 1.0, let alone 2.0. How am I going to, as a user, do all of these functionalities when the companies who have the interest, an economic interest in doing it, have decided at this point in time it's not worth it? Translating audio, I assume he's talking about translating audio, but even video, is a computer-intensive process. And if you've ever noticed closed captioning, how it never keeps up and does inaccurate translations, that's the same thing with, you talk to Siri, which has got a massive computer down in North Carolina doing the voice recognition and translating it. You notice how it gets things screwed up and sometimes takes time. So these are things which will happen when the processing power becomes cheap enough, the apps are written, and there's a market demand. None of these things, except with respect to TPM protected material, and 30 TPMs, I'm not aware of 30 TPMs. It just is not a problem in the world.
So, Mr. Berger, you just mentioned licenses and implied Mr. Rank does not want to seek a license from TCP. So has Mr. Rank ever asked for a license?
Not that I'm aware of. We've never, as far as I know, we've never turned somebody down. There may be a corner case, but as far as I know, also the idea that it's expensive. Yeah, this isn't for an individual user, because as Mr. Taylor and I've said, we can't do it. We've got some technical background.
I think Dr. Wang can do it.
Yeah, Dr. Wang, of course he can, and he wants to put it in a device that he wants to sell to the public. which of course is not permitted under the law. But individual users
So
won't
you will
be
not give Dr. White an individual license?
an individual license. We give licenses, we don't, all it says is how you have to follow the rules. And he could do what's called a repeater, and a lot of video image processing could be done. The problem is he's gonna have to sell you a very expensive box to do all of these things that he's proposing.
So if hypothetically, if Mr. Wang were to seek a license from DCP, would it be granted to
Yeah,
do
it
whatever
would
he's
be.
asking?
We don't ask what you're going to do with it. We say, you sign a license and agree to a set of rules. And if you're going to do image processing, which is,
But would any of the rules cover like the proposed uses?
yes,
So
yes,
he
image
would
pro-
or would not be prohibited from doing
no.
that?
Let's take the split screen, for example. The blog content, so far as I know, is coming in over the internet, is not protected. So what would happen would be you'd send assuming the speech is protected, again, that's a big assumption. Assuming the speech is protected, the television would take it and say, I'm putting that in this half, and I'm putting the internet feed in the other half of the screen. It just hasn't been, it's capable of Vizio, but nobody I know is doing it because for political speech, because nobody's interested in it. There's not a demand for it. If there's a demand, somebody could do an app. If Dr. Han wanted to do that processing, as long as it's in the protected space, it's allowed under the license.
Ms. Walsh, would you like to?
Yeah. So I think that we've just heard some valuable information about why the devices aren't out there in the market that let you do this. So Mr. Burr described a very expensive box. It might be that there's not a mass market for a display device or an intermediate device that lets you do all of the things that Dr. Juan wants to do. And that doesn't mean that he shouldn't have the right to do it. With regard to getting a license, I heard licenses are not for individual use, and that's borne out by the documentation of the licenses. It also has various engineering requirements, scores of pages of legalese. It restricts use that requires digital output, such as processing intensive applications in which one wishes to engage.
Has he
and
ever
space shifting.
approached DCP for a license for commercial uses within FVCR? I'm saying it right, FVCR.
I don't believe so.
He's not approached for a license, or that I was saying it wrong.
So
Has Dr. Knight ever sought a license within FVCR?
we're talking about something outside the scope of the rulemaking now, but it's never sought a license for personal uses.
What about his the commercial uses, like the opponents have identified?
No, I don't believe he sought a license for any TVCR, which is a device that doesn't exist anymore.
And then, Mr. Burr, just a follow-up, because DCP in its comments noted that DCP has taken action to remove more than 4,000 online listings for devices designed to circumvent HDCP. So was that because licenses were not sought, and what was the basis for?
They were circumvention license.
So it was a 1201.
The 1201 2 circumvention device.
Mr. Williams?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm a little perplexed or confused by the notion that this net VCR isn't in the record. I mean, we've cited to the lawsuit that Ms. Walsh filed against the government and Mr. Wong is plaintiff in, and it's at issue there as I understand it. And so I believe it is a part of the record. I'm interested to know that it does not exist yet because in other contexts, when there's no working prototype, the office has been quite skeptical of whether the proposed goals can be accomplished. And here, where you have so many wide-ranging goals that involve very different types of alterations of the content, I think that would be a wise course to follow in this particular class as well. In addition, some of the things at issue I would maintain are infringing uses One thing that's referred to as content editing, stripping certain types of things out of the content. The VidAngel opinion calls into question whether that type of activity would be lawful. Some of the uses involve advertising related uses, which are not the types of uses that are typically at issue in this proceeding. We've already talked about space shifting and the issues surrounding that. And even though the VidAngel service was a commercial service, the opinion goes beyond the facts to say that the Copyright Office has been getting this right for a long time, that no opinion has endorsed space shifting. So I don't think that it should be resigned to its facts. And the one other thing I want to mention is the First Amendment arguments. We talked about this some with respect to security researchers. Every case dealing with First Amendment issues in Section 1201 has applied intermediate scrutiny, says it passes muster, says that it is properly addressing important interests, including free speech interest on the side of copyright owners who have free speech interest, and on the side of the public who has an interest in copyright continuing to spur innovative entertainment products and other copyrighted content. So I don't think the First Amendment arguments are convincing, and even if some of them were, there are other ways to get at content aside from circumventing HDCP. As I understand it, if you're accessing a streaming service on your laptop, for example, and you're not running a cable from your laptop to your TV, that doesn't implicate HDCP. If you're viewing a smart TV and connecting directly to the internet to view a streaming service instead of running it through a set-top box and an HDMI cable, that doesn't implicate HDCP. So I think there are alternatives to everything in the record, and again, I just don't see the basis for this one, given that it's essentially all audiovisual works for any purpose that we can think of.
So Ms. Walsh, just to clarify what you were saying before, if this exemption were adopted, would it apply to any TV, VCR, or would it not?
So the exemption is a defense to 1201 and A1. So a person to take advantage of the exemption needs to create the technology to do that for their own personal use. So do you mean, would Dr. Kwong be able to create a device for his personal use to take advantage of the exemption? The answer is yes.
And that device could be the any TV, VCR. Or would be.
It could be.
So the opponents have suggested that any TV itself, which I understand already does exist and is in the market and is not circumventing, I have all that right. Okay, but that would be an alternative for many of the uses that Dr. White wishes to engage in. Do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So because it doesn't circumvent, it can't achieve any of the uses that we're talking about here that require access to the copyrighted work. So it can't do processing on the image because it can't know what's in there.
What does it do?
So that it enables you to write your own pixel data, totally ignorant of what's coming in, to write your own pixel data over the output that goes to the television. So you wouldn't be able to see the entirety of an image if you put an overlay on top of it. You wouldn't be able to do transparency. You're not able to do any of the image processing that we've been talking about, and you're not able to do any of the space or time or format shifting that we've been talking about because it doesn't give you access to the original work.
So, Mr. Berger, leaving aside the space or time shifting elements of it, to respond to what Ms. Walsh said.
Image processing is specifically permitted in the license. In addition to that, my TV at home, when I'm watching pay-per-view with Cox, will tell me, it has pixelated data coming across, telling me what number is calling. So I can decide whether I want to interrupt my TV show or put it on pause. I mean, there are a number of security systems which are linked up to Xfinity, for example, that will overlay graphics on it, give you a message that your front door is ajar. That's a weird statement, but the point is that this is perfectly doable today. It's perfectly legal. You don't need to
Do you have any
circumvent.
specific insight into, so Dr. Wong has created a product or a program called NETV, which should not involve circumvention,
I'm,
whether that would allow some of these uses?
I'm not
Ms. Walsh is
familiar
saying
with,
it's not.
I'm just not familiar with the product. I just know that if he took a license, he'd be able to do many of these things in his intermediate box. It is permissible to have store temporarily in the clear the image and apply image processing.
Mr. Taylor?
Yeah, the fact that Dr. Huang can do it himself or has a single device for his personal use, I mean, this proceeding has consistently held that that is de minimis use and does not constitute a harm. We had the Linux players, everybody wanted to play Linux, and there was a large group of people who wanted to have a DVD Linux player, and the registrar had refused that and said that they're inconvenienced. And so that alone can't be the basis for granting exemption here, that he himself can create a product for himself.
Mr. Williams?
Yes, so we have not done a technical analysis of the device, so I don't want to give the impression that I'm 100% sure it's not a circumvention device, but it is marketed as if it is not a circumvention device, and that is my understanding of Mr. Huang's position on it. I mean, on page 14 of our opposition, we quote some of the marketing for this NETV starter pack, and it does refer to things like right out of the box, it enables overlay of Facebook and Twitter feeds and SMSs from Android phones. So while it might not enable some of the content, the conduct at issue, like creating complete in the clear space shiftable copies, it does appear to address the individual uses that relate to in real time being able to both watch TV and participate in a group online conversation about the content that you're watching. So if it was a political debate, you wanted to see all of your friends' Twitter feeds. I don't know if it enables all of them, but it appears to enable Twitter feeds to be showing alongside as you're watching, so that you don't have to look at your phone, which is of course another alternative, or your laptop, or having two TVs. This seems to enable you to see Facebook messages and Twitter messages as you're consuming the content, and it says you could even do it with Blu-rays. So I guess if everyone wanted to start a movie at the exact same time and then see what everyone's reactions were, that seems possible here. So at least some of the uses that are described here are enabled, it appears. And then I also just wanted to mention that this licensing issue, I can't speak to when licenses would or not issued from DCP, but I do think it's important to know that Congress was very aware at the time that the DMCA passed that these kinds of standard setting bodies were going to move ahead, and that's what's going to enable all this content to be distributed on different kinds of devices through standards that enable encryption and things like that. So I would suggest you should not think about those kinds of licensing agreements for devices and tools in exactly the same way you've sometimes considered, does someone need to get a license to use for a remix video, for example. I think to call into question the whole fabric of how legitimate devices and content have been distributed would be a very different undertaking. So I just want to try to draw that line. It sounds like DCP would at least entertain the notion of granting a license for a lot of lots of issues.
Ms. Walsh?
Sure. So I'll reiterate that the license doesn't permit the space shifting type uses. It doesn't permit processing intensive uses that require that the information be sent to, for instance, a more capable machine, a cloud computing machine. As has been noted, a lot of these uses are data intensive. And so the image processing is easier to accomplish. In some cases, you can accomplish more than you can without the use of an external machine, and that's prohibited under the HDCP license. These are all part of the reason why there isn't an open sort of innovation ecosystem where people are able to create this functionality. So the examples that exist aren't there because people are free to compete or create the functionality that they value. They're there because they've paid for the privilege.
But that's a little bit at odds with they have a lot of examples of licensed use in the HDCP, and then they've said, well, maybe there's just not a market for this particular use, which maybe individually use it, just be long good and still evaluate it, but, I guess I'm wondering, maybe you could speak to that.
I don't understand.
Like maybe, I don't understand, I guess, where you were going with. You said it's impeding innovation of a variety of products, but they have listed a variety of products and seem to be able to participate by taking a license. So, why
Okay,
can't they take a license?
so I think two things. One, the restrictions on the license, which I just spoken about. And two, the idea that you shouldn't have to pay a fee to engage in non-infringing activities that you have every right to engage in.
What about Mr. Berger's comment that in this case, you know, like the net TV VCR, I'm not sure if I pronounced the name of the product, is it the new TV VCR or the net VCR, Mr. Wang's product? Is that the
NETVCR.
NET VCR? I mean, that would essentially be another product that someone would purchase to do this circumvention. So what, do you have a response to that?
So
Because Mr., you were just saying, you know, someone shouldn't have to buy another device or shouldn't have to take another license so that they can circumvent and engage in these uses. Mr. Berger noted that to perhaps circumvent this HDCP to take advantage of your proposed exemption, someone would have to buy the, what is it, NETVCR? Which would essentially be buying another device anyway.
Well, that's
So-
not the case. This is about establishing the right for a person to circumvent on their own. It's the rule.
Well, how, I guess my question is then how would someone go about circumventing HDCP on their own?
So, given that the master keys and the technologies are available, and it's not a terribly, difficult technical problem, someone who's familiar with image processing and cryptography would program a device to do what I described in the earlier dialogue in terms of all the steps that.
Well, could they say it became commercially available, could they purchase the NETVCR to circumvent, to take advantage of this proposed exemption?
If it were lawful for one to.
Let's keep the law out of it, and assume that if an exemption is granted and all that. Is the NETVCR device, is that something that someone would use to circumvent if they wanted to take advantage of this proposed exemption?
If it were lawful to do so, then any TVCR device would enable someone, for instance, Dr. Juan, to take advantage of the proposed exemption.
Mr. Berger?
That's really not the case, because the law is clear that that would be a circumventing device, which the Copyright Office doesn't have the power. But yes, all right.
I think I was
let's
just
suspend that.
purely like in a
Okay.
hypothetical situation asking if the NETVCR device
Suspend.
were to
pretend that-
allow someone to engage in the proposed
Right,
use.
pretend the law doesn't forbid that, okay.
Yes.
No, that's not enough. You've just heard that you also need cloud computing. Also, individuals are not going to be able, unless they're Dr. Wong or, probably in the entire country, maybe 1,000 people if that, and none of them are in this proceeding. This proceeding is at odds with the filing in the federal district court, but all of a sudden we're magically transforming a person who wants to sell a commercial product to do all this, to just be doing it for himself. There are no other users in this proceeding who are saying they want to do that, because it's very difficult. And again, the master key is not out for 2.x, what people are putting in their devices now. And it would take, a laboratory of scientists to break it. I mean, we all know that encryption ultimately is broken. But the point I think Mr. Williams made earlier is that it doesn't, what we're talking about is enabling a market, which has been fabulous. The protection has enabled the studios who are, I was involved way back when DVD was being decided, and we knew that it would get broken, but the point is that most people aren't capable of doing that, so you have a market that's established. Once you start letting Dr. Wong do this, I don't know what we're gonna be up against in terms of illegitimate boxes out there that are not permitted by the law, but you heard that you're gonna need cloud computing. This is not something for the average user or the.
Would a user need anything else besides cloud computing?
I don't even know that you could do it with cloud computing in real time. For example, he talks about imposing faces over people. Forget about rights of publicity and other issues that apply. Just think of the computer intensity to do that. I don't know if you've seen Beauty and the Beast, but what they did there is they took Dan Stevens, acted without makeup, acted the role of the Beast, and then they used servers and AI software to do that. Maybe someday in the future that'll be doable by an individual, but it isn't today and won't be for the foreseeable future. So these things are just, it's like throwing stuff against the wall.
Just because we are a little bit running low on time, so I just want to think that's very helpful. Ms. Walsh, I didn't know if you had a response to that specifically, and then also if you could answer if, because you said like if someone were to have the NETVCR device, they could engage, like, again, assuming lawful and everything else, they could engage in the proposed uses, but would they need anything else in addition to that device, such as the cloud computing?
So some of these uses are doable on your phone. Like your phone can translate Mandarin characters into English. Your phone can apply Snapchat filters and so on. So the idea that this is computationally unthinkable is not accurate. There is a greater scope of uses that are enabled by cloud computing, which is something that happens in real time. So first of all, that's all doable. Was there another part to your question? Point. Okay.
It was more just if anything else was needed beyond the NETVCR device.
Your display device and your playback device. So I want to go back a little bit to the NETV, which is the non-circumventing device, and talk about how it enables a lesser form of some of the uses that we're talking about. So it can't let you see the entirety of what you're trying to watch while it's doing an overlay. It can't make something transparent so you can keep seeing it, we'll see more information. It can't rescale something, it can't do picture in picture. Basically anything that requires it to act on the incoming signal, it can't do because it never accesses that copyrighted work.
So I guess that it can superimpose pixels onto an HDMI stream or enable overlaying your web content on existing HDMI video feeds.
Right, so you could cover up part of a picture, but you can't rescale it. Also.
Mr. Williams?
Yes, you touched on this earlier, and Jim, I think, addressed it in large part, but we've got a few links in our comments to videos that kind of show you what's involved with doing this on a licensed TV in the marketplace. And it is really just picking different ports and splitting your screen, and you can do a lot of this on a lot of different TVs. And so I don't understand, I guess, why that purchase of that type of television for someone who really is interested in this kind of conduct is so burdensome compared to having to do all of the things that Ms. Walsh is describing. And so I think those alternatives alone defeat this class. I think it's really impossible to answer the question, could the NetVCR do all of this? Because there's so many things at issue. It's a non-exhaustive list of things. And to even try to write that exemption would require you to just say audiovisual works for all lawful purposes. And the one limiting factor would maybe be that they're being transmitted through HDCP. But that, a very large percentage of audiovisual works at some point in their life cycle will be transmitted through HDCP. So it's impossible to know technically whether it can be achieved. We've heard the device doesn't yet exist. And it's impossible to analyze whether all of these things are fair uses because the comments give us very little detail about what's actually involved. And so I again would just strongly weighing against this class. It's one in this cycle that I feel like is completely beyond the pale.
Mr. Berger?
I just, one small point, and I hate to point out an inconsistency. In response to your last question about can it be done without cloud computing, as well said, it's not computationally intense, therefore it could be done with an HDCP license. It's not computationally intense.
Thank you, that's helpful. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question. We talked about a lot of the proposed uses. I guess my question for you, Ms. Walsh, is that wouldn't some of these proposed uses already be covered by some of the current exemptions, proposed exemptions, like for example, for some of the educational purposes?
Yes, I think that the record of people having need of those exemptions bolsters the need for those exemptions.
But if the current exemptions already cover that activity, why isn't an additional exemption necessary?
An exemption is necessary for the full scope of non-infringing uses, not just for those activities where there's overlap.
Mr. Williams?
Yes, I think it's a good question. I think that some of these activities are clearly covered by the existing exemptions. I don't think that circumvention of HDCP was contemplated by the existing exemptions. And as I was referencing earlier, there are ways of accessing content that don't involve HDCP. And so I think when we were having the discussion 3 years ago about, is the exemption limited only to distributions of works, and you revise the language some to make it clear that it also covers streaming services, part of that discussion did not involve HDCP. And I think the fact that they're asking for an HDCP specific class here bears that out. So yes, I would say there are other ways of exercising those exemptions that don't involve HDCP.
Ms. Walsh, has HDCP 2X been broken?
I believe that it has. Yes.
Not to my knowledge.
I'm not sure what Jim means by HDCP 2X, but 2.2, last I saw, I did not see that was happening.
Walsh, do you know,
But the point is-
2.0, 2.2, 2X, have they all been broken?
A quick Google search indicates that there are 2.2 strippers out there.
Well,
Which is to say yes.
Strippers,
Mr. Taylor?
excuse me, David Taylor, stripping HDCP is different than breaking the encryption, right? Yes.
What's the difference?
Well, the way.
No, go ahead.
The way I understand it, stripping takes the signal and splits it, as opposed to how the signal passes. It's not decrypted. So stripping is different than a hack of encryption. And I'm sorry, I'll have to get back to you. That's the better answer. I'll get back to you on that.
Okay.
Yes,
No problem.
we will as well.
Apologies, you've touched on this a little bit already, but I just really. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Walsh.
I think
Go
in
ahead.
any event, it's clear that many of the devices that are out there in the public and in Dr. Huang's home use versions of HDCP that have been, for which circumvention is readily possible.
So thank you, that's always helpful. So for the opponents, you've touched a little bit on kind of the anti-trafficking provisions that might be implicated in this exemption. I didn't know if you wanted to speak more about that.
Matt
Mr.
Williams, I'm
Williams.
happy to speak a little bit about it. I mean, I think the office has been hesitant rightly to grant exemptions where it almost invites a market to be created for a certain type of tool. And in the Section 1201 study, the office rightly concluded that circulation of tools is impossible to control and the downstream consequences are quite harmful. So this isn't even one that involves, say, like the repair shop issues we'll discuss tomorrow, where we're debating services-related issues. This is circulation of a device that could really lead to a lot of unlawful copying, and it's a device that currently doesn't exist apparently and isn't on the marketplace, depending on which side you believe in terms of whether HDCP in its current form has been encrypted. So I think it would send the wrong signal to invite these kinds of devices to be generated and put out into the distribution stream.
Ms. Walsh.
So first of all, Dr. Huang has the capability to make the device and cares about complying with the law. Second, There's never been any evidence that any of the exemptions that have been granted have led to infringement. There's no evidence that that would occur, that creating an ability to circumvent for non-infringing uses would lead to infringement. As I've explained, if your goal is infringement, it's easy enough to do that without getting this exemption.
So if the office were to, propose or recommend adoption of this proposed exemption, what would be the impact on Mr. Huang's plans to offer his any TVCR device commercially?
I don't believe it would impact those plans. It would impact
So
his
he would-
ability to, it would impact his ability to engage in the non-infringing uses himself to circumvent access controls.
So if the exemption were adopted, he would not offer his any TVCR device commercially to third parties?
Not without establishing the legal right to do so.
I guess other than the exemption, what would give him that legal guidance that it would be permitted?
The trafficking permission is part of the Green v. DOJ lawsuit in which one is challenging the constitutionality of Section 12.
So essentially, he would want this exemption, and then he would want to have the court case resolved before he would offer this device commercially, assuming the court went in his favor.
That would be one path forward, but as I said, he's very conscientious about not violating the law.
Mr. Williams, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I don't pretend to know his personal business, but the allegation is that he doesn't even live inside the United States, so I don't understand how anything within your authority could be impacted in his personal daily life with respect to granting an exemption. If he lives in Hong Kong, your exemption doesn't authorize his
I
activity.
think it lives in Singapore.
I'm sorry, I recalled that, but that, it's something I don't think has come up before, but especially now that the focus seems to only be on his personal conduct. The fact that he's outside of the country seems to be relevant to whether you could do anything to help him with respect to his personal conduct.
That's slightly different train of questions. Here's one as well. Do you know, do HDMI capture cards circumvent HDCP?
I'm not familiar with that technology by that name.
Do you know, is it possible to run the HDCP protected signal through a computer or other device that can do screen overlay or other manipulation, or even, I guess, running the rescaling or screen capture without circumventing HDCP?
So I'm unpacking the different elements of that question.
Well,
So circumventing HDCP is required to engage in the uses that are final exhibit.
I guess it's like, could you take the HDCP protected signal, run it through a computer, maybe you're making temporary copies or something, engage in the rescaling of these variety of uses, while the content is streaming without circumventing HDCP?
No, you need to circumvent HDCP to do that while it's streaming.
Okay, Mr. Barger, do you agree?
No, I disagree with that. Again, FUD faces computationally intense criteria, but as long as, and Ms. Walsh said there were a number of those that could be done, it could be what's called a repeater. And as long as it takes it has HDCP and it's got a license, it takes it and decrypts it, temporarily stores it, it can do video manipulation, trick play, lots of different things, many of the things that are in Mr. Wong's petition, and then it re-encrypts it and sends it to a screen, or it could send it to the computer screen.
That's
Well,
right, decryption is necessary.
Yeah, it's legal decryption. It's not circumventing HDCP, it is decrypting it under the license, keeping it protected, manipulate what you want to do with the video, and then you don't have to re-encrypt it if you send it right to the screen, right to the video buffer, but if you want to send it to a large screen, you'd have to re-encrypt it with HDCP. It's called a repeater function, it's right in the license and in the specifications, and you would re-encrypt it, send it to a TV that's got HDCP, which all TVs have today, and it would decrypt it and display it. So you could do that. Again, I agree that if you needed a supercomputer to impose people's faces on other people's faces, you would not be permitted to do that with HDCP if you had to send it to a cloud computer. computationally intense functionality.
So, Mr. Berger, can you give us an example of some of these repeaters? Do they come currently equipped on laptops, computers now?
No,
You have
it's-
to buy a separate device for that?
As far as I know, they're only separate devices, but there are a lot of them out there. They're like an entertainment center that has a lot of different functionality, and one is to transmit the video. In fact, in the early days, I had one of those, and it worked really well. I would have downloaded from iTunes an HD movie onto my tablet, connected it to this repeater. It would then send it to the TV screen, which I couldn't do at that point directly with my tablet. Now, the problem is that this is what Mr. Wong wants to do personally. As far as we know, for many of these things, they've either been tried, like the baseball statistics, it just didn't work. It wasn't a popular application. There isn't a big market for translating into pinyin, whatever that is, Chinese. I think that if there's a market out there like there is for live streaming games, huge market, I mean, millions of people are doing it. You know, if you're not in the market doing that with a device, you're gonna be left behind. So that's why the PS4 came out with live game streaming.
Can you buy an HDMI to RCA converter? And if so, does that only convert non-encrypted streams or non-encrypted signals?
Well, RCA, you talking about component video?
Yeah.
I don't know, I can find out.
Mr. Williams, I don't know if this is what you're referring to. One thing that is referred to on the Twitch How to Broadcast page that I referenced earlier is the Roxio Game Capture HD Pro. Now, I haven't analyzed that particular device, but that is one device that they say can be used to elevate your ability to use component cables, for example, to run the content through that device and then create clips. There was a reference earlier to it being a lower quality. I think it's still 1080i, or in some instances 1080p, so it's still a high quality with component cables.
I just wanted to add that Dr. Huang spends significant time in the United States and runs a business in the United States, and he's often in the United States.
Great, unless anyone would like to get a final word, I think we're done with the session. Thank you very much for all of your information and participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Riley, I'll get back to you on the HDMI component.